Shabbat Shalom. To look at me, you probably wouldn't realize this, but I have a civic disability, which is to say, they don't want me for jury duty. I figured this out actually when I was about 22 years old. The first time I was drawn for jury duty, went down to the courthouse. This is back in San Diego, and sitting there waiting my turn, and they called, and I went up to the courtroom for the voir dire process to see whether or not I could be fit. And they went through other people, yada, yada, yada. It was an insurance company versus homeowner association fight. And they finally had me come up onto the stand, and they asked me a few questions. And between the lawyers and the judge, they looked at me, and they were confused that both I was somebody already wearing a kippah at that time, although not a rabbi, and somebody that was also a philosophy major. And they quickly asked, so tell me, Mr. Neely, if the court were to give you instructions that violated your sense of right and wrong, would you follow the court's instructions nonetheless? To which I answered, I can't imagine that the court would ever ask me to do something fundamentally immoral and against my belief or philosophical principles. But being honest, yes, if you were to ask me to do something such as that, then I would have to, out of good conscience, not go along with it. Thank you very much, Mr. Neely. You may be excused. And that was the end of my courtroom experience until Florida. Because in Florida, I got called up for jury duty, and I was figuring, okay, it's going to be the same process. I'll get up there, they'll sit me down, they'll ask me if I'm willing to overlook my conscience and the court's instructions. But it didn't go like that. Because I got into the room, and there were about 40 of us all lined up, and they basically stood a bailiff at the door, and they said, great, you've all been selected for grand jury duty. And grand jury duty is a different kettle of fish. Grand jury duty means that there is no voir dire process. They do not dismiss you for cause. In fact, it is extremely hard for the judge to dismiss anyone, whether you are disabled, whether it is a huge economic burden to you and your family. You don't get off of the grand jury. Why? What is the function of a grand jury in Florida? And I promise this is connecting to our parasha eventually. A grand jury in most locales, as a matter of fact, not only Florida, but what is the primary responsibility of most grand juries? Actually, not to investigate. Those are very special grand juries that are sometimes given a task of investigating particular types of crimes and to look into them and actually create the case. Most grand juries, in fact, are not that type of grand jury, and we were not that type of grand jury. My Sherlock Holmes ambitions were dashed. We were the indictment form of grand jury, which is to say, and depending upon your locale, the rules will vary, there are certain crimes for which the state will need the grand jury to sign off on the indictment before a person can be brought before an actual trial. That if the grand jury doesn't agree that there is the minimum level of evidence to make it at least plausible that this person might indeed be the guilty party, and that they should go before a full trial where they'll have the regular judge, jury, lawyers, and all of that involved in all the normal trial things that you see on TV. If the grand jury won't sign off on that, then the state district attorney cannot prosecute that person. That without the indictment, you can't take them to court. So we were, if you will, the last line of defense for potential defendants to see whether or not they needed to be defendants at all. I know, sounds kind of weird. Like, why put this barrier up? If the police have investigated a crime and the attorneys, the prosecuting attorneys have agreed with the police that the crime indeed was most likely committed by suspect number A, then why would you need a bunch of busybodies who would rather be doing something else, almost certainly? We were on the grand jury for 6 months, meeting once a month to look over the indictments, which was a full-day process. Why would you bother with this intermediate step? If the person's not guilty, then the court will take care of it. And if they are guilty, well, then why delay with this indictment process?
To avoid the
It creates a safeguard. And in fact, I'm going to actually just remove one word from your earlier statement about the appearance. It avoids corruption. And I don't just mean a corruption in the sense of, $50 and I get away with it. I mean corruption in the way that the state can sometimes be weaponized against certain populations. That some suspects are quickly taken into the proceedings and given a very short, fast, kangaroo sort of trial and marched off to the gallows. Historically, not only in Florida, but most of our country has had a history of people being indicted, and before they could even say what, they were already convicted. The grand jury system was put into place to prevent that, which is why you can't get out of it. Because if you could get out of it, then the district attorney could try to get some people off of it. The wrong people who might argue with the district attorney, who might challenge the police testimony on particular cases. They might not want those people because it makes their job harder. If you actually have to meet the minimum levels of evidence, if you actually have to produce a compelling case before somebody is dragged before the court, well, that's just a lot more work. And if we all know he's guilty because he's one of those types of people that we don't like around here, then why muddy the water with anything else? Well, grand juries were put in place to exactly muddy those waters, because justice only happens if you are actually being careful, not just to avoid the appearance of corruption, but certainly to avoid absolute corruption. Again, you might be thinking, okay, but surely we could put something in place during the actual judicial proceedings. Why have this indictment issue? Why not just take them to the court and slow it down, make a certain amount of time, make sure there's definite, cross-examination by a competent, public defender for everyone at least. Let's take care of it in the courtroom rather than with this indictment process. Well, indictments are incredibly powerful weapons in the arsenal of a district attorney, of a prosecutor, and they are a very powerful weapon in the hands of the police. If they can guarantee that there will be an indictment, especially for a capital case, they may find that the defendant suddenly becomes much more cooperative even if they are innocent. After all, if the district attorney says, look, I'm going to indict you for this as murder one, and you're like, but I wasn't even there. They say, I think you were, and I've got cops that will swear that you were. They're lying, but they'll swear. I just need a conviction. I'll put you away for murder one, and that will mean your death. On the other hand, I don't want to go through a lengthy court case. Tell you what, I'll plea bargain you down to murder two, and you'll get life in prison, no parole. If the district attorney has that power of indictment in their back pocket, ready to put that as a token on the table for any bargaining, how does the defendant work against that? Do you actually say, I'm going to go to court and I'll risk the fact that those cops are going to perjure themselves? I'll risk the fact that you've got no good evidence and that a jury of 12 peers, good and true, will surely see through this facade? Or do you say, this is my life on the line? If he takes me as a murder one, there's a very good chance I'll be dead. So I guess I'll plea bargain. Even though I'm innocent, it's better than dying because the system is corrupt. The indictment process through a grand jury prevents that because it's not up to the DA. The DA can't threaten a potential defendant, a suspect, with a murder one charge. Only the grand jury can do that, and the grand jury has to actually be convinced that the charge is legitimate, that there is sufficient evidence, and because none of us were allowed to get out of it, the district attorney cannot stack who's on the grand jury to become a rubber stamp. It's a little thing, and it's a very big thing. Throughout this week's Torah portion of Shoftim, we hear again and again different insights into the nature of justice in Judaism. Tzedek, tzedek tirdof, it says. Justice, justice you will pursue. Why, say the commentaries, does the word justice get duplicated? Were the scribes simply repeating a word? They didn't repeat other words. What in the world do we mean by justice, justice you will pursue? They argue because justice is not something that just happens. Justice is not something that just occurs. It needs to be pursued vigorously, actively. It is not a passive achievement. It only comes with hard work and setting up barriers, to your own decision-making process. Tzedek, tzedek tirdof. Justice for yourself and justice for those you accuse. There needs to be justice on both sides of the balance of the equation. If you don't have justice for all, then you have justice for none. Time and time again, the Torah, and then later our sages, and then all the way through the last 3,000 years of Jewish history, we have filled books full of how we must pursue justice. And we have put limits upon ourselves of how evidence can be given in a Jewish court, of how strict judges must be to recuse themselves from adjudicating on any case in which they might be biased, on how hard it must be for the witnesses to be grilled in giving their testimony, especially when a life is at stake, and how careful we must be to hear all sides without prejudice, without bias, and without a preconceived notion of who may be guilty. Indeed, the highest standard is that you should look at everybody who comes before you as though you did not know them, and they are probably lying and guilty. That means you will treat all of them fairly. You will examine all of them equally, from the district attorney to the suspect in rags. All of them should be given equal treatment. All of their words should be weighed with equal value and weight. Judaism doesn't mess around with justice. This is not something where we are casual. This is not something where we say, well, God will work it out. This is one of the great mitzvot that was placed upon the shoulders of all humanity to create a system of justice and to allow fairness to become the benchmark of our societies. It is something that all of us have to participate in, which is why, if you can, and they ask, serve on a jury. Help those that are there to get a fair trial. They may be guilty, find them guilty. They may be innocent, see that they are not guilty. Or it may be a civil matter and decide who is more in the right and who is perhaps more in the wrong. This is not something that can be outsourced. This is not something that can be handed off to an algorithm. This is on our shoulders, our responsibility. We have to pursue justice. Shabbat Shalom.